and welcome to this week's episode of the Goodrum Show with me, Chris Goodrum. As you can see, back in my usual place. Indeed. The room's still a bit of chaos, but I've managed to clear enough room to sort of reuse the study, so back here again. Big thank you to everybody that watched last week's episode of the show, liked, commented, all that kind of stuff. I think there's some comments I haven't caught up on as yet, so bear with me and I'll do so as soon as I'm able to do so. Right, okay, let's crack on to this week's episode of the show. As you can see, 7 samples, so I'll try and whip through them as quickly as possible and keep the waffle to a minimum. I've kind of I toyed with doing an episode of the show on rye whiskies for quite some time now, and I was fortunate enough to be part of the World Whisky Awards judging team and did the sort of final 7 individual category winners in the Rye Whiskey section, and I thought about maybe sort of putting in some other ryes and maybe using them, and I thought, well, let's just do the whole batch, shall we say. So before I go any further, any comments I do make are wholly my own and have no bearing on the company employs me. This episode of the show is not endorsed or supported by the World Whisky Awards or the Whisky Magazine. This is wholly my own doing, so if I say something a little bit rude, then it's my head on the or my neck on the chopping block, as they say. So like I said, this is purely, I suppose, giving you a little bit of an insight into my school of thought with regards to when I judge these particular spirits. So I won't tell you which was the overall winner. Obviously that information is fairly readily available at the moment, but I'll obviously let you know which one actually was voted as best rye whiskey, world's best rye whiskey for 2022, and which one I thought was my personal favourite, which could be the same or it might be different. Well, we'll obviously find that one out. So without further ado, there's obviously 7 different distilleries. I'm not going to go into any information about them. You can find out any information about these distilleries brands online, and I'm guessing the links are probably going to be in the box below as per normal. So right, let's just have a look at today's lineup then, shall we? We're going to kick off with what was voted Best Canadian Rye. This was Best Canadian No Age Statement. So obviously what you tend to get in round 1, for those of you that don't know the format of the competition, you get sent a load of samples of rye whiskey, for argument's sake. You'll either get, back in the day it used to be, you'd get the whole lot. You'd get No Age Statement, 12 years old and under, 13 and over, etc, etc. So they're all tasted by the various groups, and you get an overall best Canadian, as in this case, which is the Crown Royal Northern Harvest, made from a mash bill of 95% rye, apparently. Rye number 2, and as you notice, I am doing them in the kind of order that we tasted them for the competition, which is basically ABV order. This is the Best Australian, 12 years old and under. It's the Archie Rose Distilling Rye Malt Whisky, bottled at 46%. Rye number 3 was Best English, 12 years old and under, and this is the Adnams Rye Whisky, and bottled at 47%. As there's 7 samples, the Black Glen makes an appearance, yes. So obviously this is just a random placement for this glass. There's no bearing on, well, it might, so rye number 4 is the Best Danish No Age Statement. This was the Stauning Rye Winter Edition 2021, and it was bottled at 48%, sorry. Rye number 5 is the world's best Dutch rye. This is the Millstone 100 rye, bottled at 50%. For those of you that don't know, they seem to sort of like the number 100. Apparently it's been aged for 100 months, it's 100% rye mash, it's 100% proof, it's 100% hand distilled, etc, etc, which is why it's called the 100 rye. So that's rye number 5. Rye number 6 is one I've never actually heard, a distillery I've never heard of. It's called the Westphalian, and this was best German, 12 years old and under. This is cask number 127, I believe, distilled in 2016. So it was in the best, it was in the German 12 years and under category, and has been aged in New American oak. Now, from what I've read about the distillery, they do seem to do a lot of, weirdly enough, this is actually labelled as a single malt, or I think it was anyway, so, but it's a rye. I'm a little confused, but it's in the rye category, so I'm assuming it is a rye whiskey. You never know with these Germans. So yeah, they seem to do an awful lot of cask, different types of casks. I think they've used ex-Scottish whisky casks. I think they did one in export Ellen cask. I think they've done them in ex-Speyside casks, Virgin American oak, etc., wine casks, all that kind of stuff. So yeah, this could be interesting. And number 7, again another brand that I can't say I've ever heard of. This is the Senator Barrel Proof Straight White Rye Whiskey, best American whiskey, 12 years old and under, or best American rye I should say. It is apparently a sort of independent label. It seems to have been created by a chap called Dave Schimmer, who was behind Redemption Bourbon. And this is casks, or I think it's a single cask, or might be several, I don't know exactly, that was sourced from MGP, and is apparently 6 years old, or at least the youngest spirit is 6 years old, and it was bottled for a company called Proof and Wood Ventures, who again I can't say I've ever heard of, and it's a 95% rye mash. So back in the day, anything that was sort of came out of MGP was always had a bit of a raised eyebrow, as it was a bit of a well, you know, but you know, they've got some serious stock. They pump it out, they age some stuff. There has been some really good bottlings from MGP, so I wouldn't rule it out being good. And let's put it this way, these all have won their individual categories, so it's got to mean that they've all got something going for them, but obviously we'll see which one comes out on top then. So yeah, that's this week's lineup. Let's kick off with a bit of Canadian then, shall we? Right, okay, so Crown Royal Northern Harvest. Let's see what the nose gives us on this then, shall we? Sweet, bubblegummy, syrupy, sweet, oak. Don't really get a great deal of rye. There's a little astringency in the background. I mean, if this really is the best Canadian rye whiskey, then, well, I hate to think what the competition was like, but, you know, this is the thing, isn't it? You know, I know Canada makes some stunning rye whiskies, and I'm afraid this really isn't a stunning rye whiskey at the end of the day, and you just have to judge what's entered, I suppose, which is why for years and years on end sort of Glenkinchie was always best lowland whiskey, when we know for a fact it certainly wasn't, but it was the only one that was entered. Not that I'm saying that this was the only Canadian rye that was entered, but okay, you know, the prior group obviously must have seen something in this. Personally, it's sweet, confected, and doesn't really have a great deal of rye character, certainly not on the nose anyway, so don't think this is going to win somehow, but anyway, let's see what the palate's like. Soft, sweet, confected, a little bit cloying. Okay, the rye does come through on the finish. It's giving it a balancing, intense spiciness, but it kind of makes it feel short as well. It doesn't feel like it's got a huge amount of age to spirit, although it was a no age statement. Well, I know it had no age statement, but it could have been in the 12 years old and under category or whatever. But no, it feels really young, really sweet, oaky, confected, and not really complex enough to win the competition, I think. Okay, so let's move on to the best Australian. This is the Archie Rose Distilling Rye Malt, bottled at 46%. Now that's a lovely nose. It's got a lovely complexity. It's got a soft, silky, almost liqueur-like sweetness, but the slight bitterness of the rye is balancing. There's some crystallised orange peel, toffee, dried fruit, touch of cinnamon. Feels like it's got a bit of age to it. I mean, it was 12 years and under the category that it was entered in, so there could be some relatively mature spirit at play here. Oak is getting a little bit toasty. There's a touch of almost kind of candle wax. That's a really intriguing nose. That's a complex nose. That's everything that I'm afraid the Crown Royal certainly wasn't. A little bit of coffee now. That's a very, very good nose. So pass on. It's pleasant, it's okay, it doesn't quite have the complexity of the nose. Coffee, honey, toffee, a little bit of rye spice. It's very soft. Spices are quite dry. There's again a feeling of age there, but it just seems to lack some of the intensity of the nose. Reasonable end, bit of spice on the end. I mean, it's again, it's one of those sort of whiskies where you stick your nose in a glass and you go, oh, that's really, really good. And then you put it in your mouth and you just sort of think, well, and this is the thing about judging, you know. I mean, if I was drinking this, if I was handed a glass of this, I'd go, yeah, that's really quite pleasant. But the point is, I'm trying to make a judgment between all of these, and I'm probably being overtly critical, and you have to be, because the things that separate these things are very very small. You know, you can have some stunning whiskies and you've got to judge between the two, you know, and you think it all comes down to those just very small elements. And although, like I said, I thought the nose was really stunningly good, the palate just didn't quite live up to it. But, you know, overall, still a fairly decent rye, I think. Right, okay, so let's move on to the Adnams. Let's see what this gives us on the nose. It's quite oaky, it's subtle. A little bit of citrus, some smoky spice. It's relatively simple. It certainly lacks the complexity of the Archie Rose, but then, even though it's 12 years old and under, I don't get the same sort of sense of maturity. It's a little bit rummy. The sort of dried fruit notes are coming through as a little bit of a sort of, like I say, a rum edge, but it certainly doesn't have anywhere near the level of complexity that the Archie Rose bottling had. But again, yeah, it's pleasant. Let's see what palate's like. Sweet, oaky, just this side of confected. Again, it's got that kind of rummy dried fruit kind of character. A little bit sort of cloying, but again, just under the overt cloying sweetness level. There's some spices that do balance that up. There's a little bit of citrus. But it's again a little bit one-dimensional. It's a bit kind of like sort of oak, rye, you know, in that, not overt rye, but obvious rye, if you see what I mean. it does grip a little bit on the finish, and so, you know, I like the finish. I thought the finish was probably the, the best part about this particular bottling. And again, it's a solid whiskey. It's not a sort of like, you know, earth-shattering, but it's not as poor as, say, the Crown Royal. It's kind of average, I suppose, and let's put it this way, you know, not every whiskey on the face of the planet can be outstanding or poor, as the case may be. There's so many whiskies that really do just fall into that kind of like pleasant, average. But like I said, when you're judging, you become sort of slightly, you have to be slightly more critical, and there are certainly some shortcomings when compared to what's come sort of previously. So let's move on to the best Danish. This is the Stauning Rye Winter Edition 2021. Let's see what the nose gives us on this end, shall we? Peppery, chocolatey, young, getting that sort of rose petally kind of mar note. Again, I'm not getting a great deal of complexity. It kind of like says, well, hello, I'm Rye. But it is really quite young and quite simple and bit lean. And this is the biggest issue I've always had with Stauning, and certainly their rye, is that it has a leanness because it tends to be bottled too young. I mean, I'm not getting a whole load of oak. I'm not getting any real vanillins or anything like that. Yes, you can say, well, you're getting plenty of the rye character, but there's not a great deal of complexity here. Like I said, apart from a bit of pepper and a bit of spice, you know. So again, it's not one that's kind of lending me to believe that this could be crowned as best rye whiskey. But anyway, let's see what the palate's like. I'm not really a fan of that finish. It's young, it's fainty, it's peppery, spicy, a little bit more complexity on the palate, i.e. there's a little bit more spice, there's some cinnamon, pepper. There's a little bit of astringency on the back end, a bit of green, almost herbal spice notes. But that faintiness, that youthfulness, that marry note is just constant. And again, this backs up the issues I've always had with Stauning, is that their ryes are, like I said, bit too lean, bottled too young, don't have enough complexity, don't have enough oak character. I mean, I'm being probably really, really hard on this. I mean, it's pleasant at the end of the day. It's not god awful. It wouldn't have got this far if it didn't have some, you know, intrinsically good characteristics, which it does. But like a lot of these sort of continental European whiskies and ryes and things like that, they just seem to be bottled far too young, and this one is a prime example. It just really could have done with A, some slightly more longer maturation, and B, some slightly more active casks. But there you go, like I said, this is a competition. Right, okay, so let's move on to the best Dutch. This is the Millstone 100 rye. That's a lovely nose. It's soft, it's dusty, it's actually got a maturity beyond what you would expect from 100 months. It's got a lovely sort of slight soft pepperiness, a bit of bitterness. It's got a really nice bittersweet kind of balance, and I think the 100 rye has always been quite a popular bottling because it has this softness. It doesn't quite have this astringency that some other rye whiskies can have. There's a little bit of oxidised fruit, slightly nutty, a little bit of coconut, balanced oak, really, really balanced. And that's obviously one of the things you instantly look out for on the nose, and certainly when you're judging. You know, does it have the balance? The oak is starting to come through a little bit more sweeter, a bit more vanilla as it spends time in the grass, but there's a little bit of tannins, there's a bit of grip in the background. It's just a gorgeous nose. Really full, aromatic. See what that's on. Well, it opens with oxidised fruit, a little bit of creamy vanilla. If I'm going to pick holes in this, which obviously, judging one has to do so, it's a little flabby on the mid palate. There's just not quite enough citrus, there's not quite enough spice. I mean, the spice comes through lovely on the end, and it develops quite pleasantly. There's some lovely chocolatey notes. There's a touch of the spike of youthful rose petal marl right on the finish. I mean, it has a lovely intensity. The oak kind of like gets to the mid palate, I suppose, and then kind of just sort of tapers off fairly quickly into the finish. It's, like I said, it verges slightly on the flabbiness on the mid palate, and like I said, you know, judging these spirits is a question of pulling them apart to the nth degree, because you know they're so different. I mean, so far all 5 of these have been completely different to each other, and it's really difficult to sort of, you know, say one is better than the other. So you really have to pull them apart, and you have to sort of ignore the sort of the noise. And like I said, this is a lovely rye, but there is that but. Okay, so let's move on to the Westphalian. Let's see what the nose gives us on this then, shall we? That's got some intensity. I mean, yes, all right, it is cask strength, one assumes cask strength, 54.8. Dark, intense rye spice, treacle, violets, wood spice. Whoa, toasty oak. I mean, that's intense. I mean, that's gripping. There is a little bit of sweetness though that's just sitting under the surface, and it's, you know, a little bit of kind of toffeed marzipan-y oak, some dried fruit, a little bit of almost what feels like kind of column still notes. There's some almost molassy notes. It's dark, it's intense. This is how I like my rye. I like my rye to be dark. This is really an impressive nose, I think. Okay, if I'm going to again pull it apart a little bit, maybe a little bit more sweetness on the nose might have helped, but it's got a real sort of dark rye complexity. You can almost smell the grain, so you can't argue that it doesn't have typicity. Let's see what the parts are. Again, dark, spicy, intense, quite rummy. Again, I'm getting the feeling we're looking at a column distilled spirit. I don't know for definite, but I would guess, if not a column still, possibly a Holstein still. Luscious, almost verging on the tropical, but that darkness and that spiciness just stops the sweetness getting out of hand. And same with the oak. It's got an almost minerality on the finish. For a German spirit, yeah, I'm really impressed, it has to be said. You know, like I said, I've come across so many European ryes and spirits that have been bottled far too young, that are one-dimensional. This has just been bottled absolutely really just oh, this is stunning, this is great. I don't know, I've never heard of this distillery before, but hopefully I will do so in the future, because if that is the quality of their the bottlings that they do on the whole, then well, I'm seriously impressed. I'm going to put a little drop of water. I don't really think it actually needs it, but I'm just going to see what that does to it. Okay, let's dial down the sort of darkness a little bit, and I'm certainly now getting column still, rummy dried fruits, coconut. It's more like a grain whiskey now. It's still impressive, but just not quite so dark. A little bit more sort of marzipan-y sort of oak, I guess. Let's see what comes on it. Again, the intensity is dialed down a bit. I really don't think you needed to put any water with that. Again, it's kind of emphasised that sort of column still dried fruit. It's dialed down the spice and intensity a bit, which is pretty much as you would expect. So it kind of loses points a little bit because it doesn't do water particularly well. And again, like I say, you know, when you're sort of like, you know, you want to score a whiskey as the best, it's got to do everything. It's got to handle water if it's cask strength. I don't think this handles water particularly well. Neat, I'm blown away. Neat, it is absolutely stunning. But like I said, when you're talking about such small differences in scoring and what you're looking for, you know, there's almost kind of looking for negatives, which is probably the wrong way of judging a spirit. But you know, it's kind of the way you have to, I suppose. Certainly when, like I said, when you're judging spirits of a very diverse character. But anyway, like I said, neat, absolutely stunning. Water, not so blown away. Okay, so on to the final bottling of the day. This is the Senator Barrel Proof Straight Rye Whiskey. At least 6 years old, apparently. Let's see what the nose gives. That's got a lovely maturity. Quite soft, fruity, spicy, herbal, a little bit of camphor, mint, bit of tar, toasted oak, treacle, cinnamon, damson possibly. I mean, this is a lovely nose. Doesn't have quite the darkness or intensity of the Westphalian, and it's sort of more like, I guess, the Archie Rose, but it's a stunning nose. It really is. It's got everything you'd want for in an American rye, it has to be said, and it just goes to show that MGP do distill some great spirits, and obviously I'm assuming that this was purchased, I don't know the bottling company. I'm just guessing that this may well have been purchased pretty much as a batch, maybe ready for bottling. I don't honestly know, but I'm guessing the sort of, like, you know, a distillery the size of MGP is going to have all manner of aged spirits, and it's literally you just roll up there and go, okay, governor, this is my parameters, this is what I want, what you got, kind of thing. Stick it in the back of me truck. Damn, that's good. That's a good nose. Alcohol is really well contained as well. I mean, I wouldn't have guessed that this is, you know, almost approaching 60%. I mean, sure, pass right. Intense, spicy. I can taste the alcohol now. I mean, that's clamping down on the sweetness. It's got some lovely dark rye notes, bit of spice, again a little bit of a herbal note, a little bit of camphor, some mint, touch of oak. It's got a maturity again. It's not the sort of soft vanilla fluffy oak. There is a darkness there at its core, you know, a lovely dark rye character. Maybe not quite as intense as the Westphalian, but there's certainly an intensity there. This is a quality spirit at the end of the day, it has to be said. The spices really do bite on the finish. They're dancing all over my tongue. I mean, it's just like, oh, you know, even though the finish is a little bit masked, you know, the spice kind of just hangs on in there, you know. It's just like, that's an impressive finish. Right. So this is the kind of, I suppose, the litmus test or acid test, I suppose, whichever you want to call it. Let's put a little drop of water and see what happens. Okay, so it brings out a little bit more of the oak. It's a little sweeter, not quite so spicy. Still, there's plenty of those spice notes there, though. It's not quite so herbal, not quite so intense, but there's still some intensity there. It's still got some lovely rye character, and there's maybe just, like I said, a little bit more sweetness, which is, you know, something that I often look for with rye, because it can be quite astringent and quite spicy, and really it does need that little bit of sweetness just to balance things up. So we'll pass on. Ooh, that's gorgeous. That's silky. Like angels dancing on my tongue. It is just luscious, it's juicy, it's fruity. Again, it's possibly pushed up that little bit of oak sweetness, a little bit more vanilla. The spices are still there, they're softened, they're a little bit sweeter, but they've still got a slight bitterness to the edge. Gorgeous balance, lovely length. That is just simply a stunning rye whiskey, it has to be said. Absolutely stunning. What more can you say? Okay, so let's sum today's episode of the show. Firstly, a big thank you to the Whiskey Magazine Okay, let's sum today's episode of the show. Firstly, a big thank you to the World Whisky Awards for having me as a judge again this year. A big thank you to the for the samples. You know, it's always it's an honour to be asked to be a judge for the awards. I know there are probably 1,000,001 sort of competitions out and about there, but I still think the World Whisky Awards have probably, you know, have a definite cachet. And I don't say that because I've worked for the Whiskey Magazine in the past, but I certainly think that they are certainly on a par with the International Wines and Spirits competition. But anyway, let's have a chat about this little set of samples. Okay, the Crown Royal, the best Canadian. Well, that was really quite a disappointment, it has to be said. Like I said, I know there is a lot better, in my personal opinion, Canadian rye whiskies out there. There's a lot better Canadian whiskies than this particular one, and like I said, there always has to be a loser, doesn't there, I suppose. Oh god, yeah, go on and shoot me. The Archie Rose, yeah, no, that was a good rye, that really was. It was, you know, a lovely nose. It just kind of let itself down a little bit on the palate at the end of the day. Again, if I was looking at these to possibly retail them, I would say that's fine. You know, it's still a lovely whiskey, but you know, looking at them with the critical eye of a judge, you know, you have to pick the holes, and the holes were there. It wasn't as great a palate, but you know, still, you know, a pretty good whiskey. The Adnams, it was okay. It was average. I mean, you know, nothing wrong with being average. You know, not every whiskey can be world beating. Not every whiskey can be absolutely god awful. You know, there are a lot of whiskies that sit in this kind of average middle ground, neither good nor bad. You know, and if we didn't have average whiskies, you know, they're kind of almost like, I suppose, a benchmark to a certain extent. So it was a solid whiskey. If you were given a bottle of that, or even if you purchased a bottle of that, I don't know how much it retails for, I don't think you would be too disappointed. So yeah, it was okay. The Stauning, like I said, it was just typical of sort of European sort of whiskies, I guess, in that it had been bottled too young, not enough oak character. Really quite disappointing, quite lean, and that, like I said, when I was tasting it, tends to be an issue that I often have with Stauning. Some of their other bottlings, I mean, you know, when I have my retailer's hat on working for a certain company, I do have some of their bottlings on the shelf. So I don't think, you know, that I think there are spirits, you know, bottlings they do that are really good. But they're just sure they're rye, they're 100% rye, can often tend towards leanness, and this one certainly did. The Millstone, I liked it. I mean, it's a good whiskey. It, like I said, pulling it apart a little bit, I can see why it won. I can see why this was world's best rye whiskey, because it is a good rye at the end of the day. You know, some people obviously saw a lot more in it than I did. Like I said, pulling it apart, it just fractions at the end of the day, just a little bit sort of flabby on the mid palate. I have tasted other bottlings of this that have been absolutely outstanding, and this particular bottling didn't quite live up to it. But you know, I've got no issue with that being sort of crowned best rye whiskey, because you know, it's certainly not too shabby, as they say. The Westphalian was Obviously, as you can probably tell, that was the rye that I scored the second highest. It was basically Millstone, the Westphalian, and obviously the Senator. I thought the Westphalian had an awful lot going for it. I really was impressed by this particular bottling, because it kind of, like, to a certain extent, reset a lot of my perceptions of German spirits and German rye, because it had been given more than 5 minutes in a bloody cask, for God's sake. It had some maturity. It had that lovely dark rye intensity that I love, but it just didn't take water well. Now, like I said, you know, if I had my retailer's hat on, I would have no problem at all sticking that on the shelf and basically saying to a customer, just don't put any water with it. You really don't need to do so. But like I said, you know, when you're judging, it's the minutiae or minutiae, whatever. It's small bits, you know, that at the end of the day. And the Senator, obviously, now, you know, when I was tasting them, it was a case of, now do I like this because this is the highest ABV? Is my palate so wired that, or am I so wired, that because I taste an inordinate amount of cask strength whiskies, I find anything other than cask strength whiskies really boring and dull and just not up to it? And well, no, the answer is no. It's stupid, really, to say that. It just had the most complexity. It handled water really well. And like I said, it was a real sort of toss-up between that and the Westphalian, and it just basically handled water better than the Westphalian, and that for me was why I gave it my highest score. Certainly, you know, if you guys in the States can get hold of a bottle of that, then, you know, if their other bottlings are anywhere near the quality of that, then brilliant. That's really, really good. So yeah, that's this week's episode of The Show in the Bag. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope it's kind of given you a bit of an insight into sort of what goes on in my head when I'm judging, which is a bit of a scary thought, really, isn't it? And you know, how judging you have to sort of have this kind of uber critical head on, and you know, you are essentially picking apart a spirit rather than sort of saying, is this a great spirit? It's a bit of a weird way of working, but like I said, when you are comparing spirits together that are very different to each other, you have to basically pare it all back down to sort of quality and balance. And you know, and the best balance, the best spirit surely should come to the top of the tree. And like I said, at the end of the day, I've got no issue with the Millstone being sort of crowned sort of best rye whiskey. It's a gorgeous whiskey. It's gorgeous rye whiskey at the end of the day. Personal preference, like I said, was for the Senator, but yeah, no problem elsewhere. And I don't seem to have an awful lot of whiskey left. Anyway, until next week, I hope you've enjoyed this week's episode of the show. All I have to say is good dramming and good afternoon.